It was a promise Barack Obama first made when he was running for president the first time, to close Guantanamo Bay. This morning he announced his plans to do it again.
Today, the department is submitting to Congress our plan for finally closing the facility at Guantanamo once and for all. This is about closing a chapter in our history.
Not surprisingly, support for the move in Congress appears sparse. Joining me now to discuss it are Arun Rath, he's correspondent for GBH and NPR. He's covered Guantanamo for Frontline in the World, including the trial of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Good to see you, Arun. Michael Moen, an attorney who's represented two Guantanamo detainees, both of whom have been released and relocated. Good to speak to you again, Michael. Can I get some facts on the table, and correct me if I'm wrong, just to bring people up to speed. 91 prisoners from a high of almost 700 under George W. Bush. About 240 was the high under Obama. 30 are proposed to be transferred to other countries. Details not yet specific. So 60-some remain, many of whom have had absolutely no charges ever filed against them. Am I right so far?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Okay, so what's the president proposing, Arun?
Simply put, he's proposing that the prisoners cleared for release be sent out, be transferred to other countries, and the prisoners in this more difficult group, this is about 50 people, they be transferred to facilities in the U.S., either private prisons, either prisons like the Supermax prisons
in Colorado, for example,
or military facilities.
And some of those people, again, will be tried, and some will just continue to be held indefinitely without charges, without trial.
Yeah, there are some that are already being tried by the military commissions, but the so-called forever prisoners, people who are being detained indefinitely, that will still go on. And actually, more than half of this document that the Obama administration released today was, there was a 10-page appendix which was explaining, reassuring Congress for the reasons why, if transferred to the U.S., they would still be able to be kept in indefinite detention.
But even some people, like a Democratic senator from Colorado, Bennett, says, I don't want anybody here, even though he's got the Supermax where the Tsarnaev brother is. Is this a good idea, Michael, or no?
It's a good idea to the extent that he wants to close Guantanamo, but simply moving Guantanamo is not really a solution.
Meaning what?
Meaning that you're still going to have indefinite detention without charge or trial. And that's an anathema to our legal traditions. It's anathema to the rule of law. It's unacceptable.
Well, in addition to that, he has also not made clear, I mean, for a Congress that's been really skeptical, my understanding is he's not even specified what the locations are. And maybe because he doesn't want specific blowback, but isn't it reasonable for Congress to say, we'd like to know where you want to transfer these prisoners before we say yes or no, Michael?
Sure, but there's only a handful of places that they could realistically go.
I thought he said there are up to 13 of them.
Well, however many Supermax prisons there are, but the point is that wherever they went, whatever prisons were identified, Congress was going to be against it. This plan was dead on arrival before he announced it.
You know, I want to, Center for Constitutional Rights echoed essentially what Michael said today, Arun. Moving these detainees who have not been and will never be charged with any crime or prison in the U.S. does not close Guantanamo. Guantanamo merely relocates it to a new zip code. The infamy of Guantanamo has never been just its location, but rather its immoral and illegal regime of indefinite detention. If the president's argument since 2007 or 8 has been, this is causing us problems around the world, we are seen as this shameless country that imprisons people without trials, without charges, how does this improve our standing anywhere by just transferring them to a U.S. prison? What does it achieve on the president's to-do list?
Well, I think in terms of the optics to, I don't know if there's a better word to use, but Guantanamo Bay itself, the military detention center there, has become such a symbol. I mean, I would tend to think that closing that down, even if indefinite detention still takes place in the U.S., speeding some of these trials along, maybe bringing some of these people into federal courts, it's going to do something for at least the perception of things.
Because Guantanamo has become a symbol unto itself. Do you agree with that or no?
Yeah, it is. It's a symbol unto itself. The problem is this reliance on military commissions. To, you know, steal a phrase from Donald Trump, they're a disaster. They've convicted less than a handful of people over the last 10 years that they've been in existence, whereas the Article 3 federal courts in the United States have convicted hundreds of accused defendants accused of terrorist activities.
Including one pretty prominent one right here.
Before 9/11 and since 9/11. So this whole notion that our federal courts can't handle these cases is ridiculous.
How about the argument that it's a security risk? That if you know that a terrorist or 2 or 5 or 6 are at a particular location, the potential for that to be a terrorist target increases dramatically. You're shaking.
They've been there in prison for years. In Florence, Colorado, you know, they've been all over the place.
Florence is where the ultimate supermax
There's a
is. Again, where
supermax there.
Tsarnaev is.
Tsarnaev is there. How much more of a target could they be than they already are?
I know you were both at Guantanamo. Were either of you in the actual facility? Were either of you in the facility?
I was there covering the commissions, and there are no tours of the prison facility while those are going on.
How about you?
I've been in the base, in the prison numerous times.
Well, the stunning thing to me is 2,000 military personnel for 91 prisoners. I mean, talk about expense beyond that. Give us a short version. What's it like? What are the conditions like?
You know, originally they were in for a long time in Camp 4, which is sort of an open air barracks kind of facility. Then they built Camp 5 and Camp 6, which are modern concrete prisons modeled after minimum and maximum security prisons in the United States. They're prisons. They're like any other
So it's
prison
not
you'd
so
see.
much the conditions being horrible, it's the fact that so many of them are not charged, so many are there for an extended period of time, indefinite in some
Some might
cases.
say that the actual living conditions in Guantanamo might be better than they would experience if they went to a supermax prison.
You know, the other thing I don't get about this is there's no chance that this passes Congress. I think that's a fair assumption. And the president refused to answer questions today as to whether or not he'd do an executive order, even though he promised in 2008 he was going to do an executive order within a year. So what's the upshot here, Arun?
I honestly wonder what the administration is thinking is going to happen with this, because, again, there's been 7 years to put this plan forward. The president said today that he's been working really hard the last 7 years, but if you look at this plan that was issued today, it's barely even a plan. It's more of a statement of principles and purpose. So there's a lot of detail lacking in it.
So is it purely to say that I did or I attempted to do what I said I would? I mean, what's the agenda here, Michael?
It's the same plan he announced in May of 2009 in his National Archives
So what's the
speech.
end game 7 years
I
later?
think hopefully he's trying to get it off of the plate of the next Democratic president, or perhaps remove it so it's not a precedent for the next Republican president. But you got to remember, George W. Bush did more to close Guantanamo than Barack Obama could ever. George Bush released 532 men from Guantanamo, and nobody said a word. Nobody raised a holler. So what is the problem with this president continuing what George Bush started 10 years ago?
So it's all politics.
Oh, it's all politics. This is red meat. This is going to go off like an atomic bomb in the presidential campaign.
Arun, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate
Pleasure.
it. Michael,
Thank
it's good
you.
to see you again.
Thank
Last
you.
time we spoke, you were in Uruguay,
That's
greeting
right.
your client.